I'm slightly unusual on this panel in that I've been here since 1996, so I have actually missed the entirety of the Blair years and most of the Cameron years. The reason why I left the country in 1996 was because I used to work for the British government. I used to work in the John Major's administration, and I helped privatise Railtrack, part of British Rail, and then fled the country. As Mark noted, most pundits suggested before the election that there was no way the Tories were going to win this election outright. I was one of those pundits. I wrote an article in the Freeman in which I suggested that Britain might actually be on the verge of a return to socialism. Of course, I was wrong, and I'm happy to be so. But the question is, the Tories won. Is liberty safe? I think there are several ways to look at this, and the way I'm going to look at it, for the most part, is for the issue of regulation. Government spending has been coming down, absolutely. Government is wasting far less of the UK taxpayers' money. However, it is interfering, over the past 15 years, has been interfering more and more in the lives of the individual businessman and the individual citizen in the United Kingdom. So the question is, from that standpoint of economic freedom, is liberty safe? Well, there's some good news and some bad news. I think the good news is that we're likely to see much more deregulation of business. And one of the most important indicators of this was the appointment of Sajid Javid as the business secretary. Whoever holds the position of Secretary of State in a United Kingdom government department has a very great influence on how successful the policies, the government's policies are in getting forward in the United Kingdom. When I worked in the Department of Transport, for instance, we had a series of weak ministers and then we had a series of strong ministers. The series of weak ministers were unable to get any of their policies implemented. The civil service, the bureaucracy, stopped them, raised objections, filibustered until they hoped they would get a new minister who would actually be even more favourable to them. Eventually that stopped. The appointment of a couple of very strong ministers led to the pushing through of policies like the privatisation of British Rail. So the appointment of Sajid Javid, who, as my friend Donald Blaney says, is not a left-winger, as the business secretary, is very important. He has already set out a target of £10 billion in red tape savings, cutting bureaucracy to boost the economy by about £10 billion. There are several ways that they can do this, and the Tories actually have a couple of reasonably good policies that were not implemented very well by the previous business secretary, the Liberal Democrat Vince Cable. For instance, the red tape challenge, which I know Mark is very sceptical about because he actually took part in it, where business leaders have a chance to challenge regulations that are causing undue burden on their businesses. I think if implemented properly and with somebody like Sajid Javid in charge of it, then there's a possibility that that might achieve some business-driven deregulation. There's also the one-in, two-out rule, a regulatory budget, whereby if you introduce one new regulation, you have to get rid of two old regulations. So far, the British have done this the way they always do, which is they introduce a very costly new regulation and they get rid of some quaint regulation from the Middle Ages. You know, like you're not allowed to sell oranges on a Sunday unless you're a freeman of the City of London, or you are allowed to shoot a Scotsman with an arrow from the steps of Queen's College, Oxford, things like that. But I think with Sajid in charge, we have a chance to actually have some real, genuine one-in, two-out regulation, and that could seriously reduce the regulatory burden. But more important than this is the employment law reform that they are pushing forward. And I look after employment regulation in the United States for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I just wish we had an agenda like this, or somebody was pushing an agenda like this. They're going to rule that half of a workforce must actually vote in an election vote in a ballot to have a successful decision for a strike. So half of the workforce must actually vote. And in the public sector, and most unionization in the UK these days is in the public sector, just like in the US, 40% of those entitled to vote must vote yes for the strike. So there's a double layer to try and prevent the sort of massive transport disruption that we see in London regularly over the summer as the Trotskyite RMT union shuts down the tube. They're going to allow scabs. There's been a rule saying that when workers go out on strike, you're not allowed to hire contract agency workers to replace them temporarily. That rule was actually described as insane in the Conservative manifesto, so they're going to get rid of that. A very important rule is that they're going to not only have opt-ins for paying union dues, so that you don't have an opt-out, you're not automatically a member of the union, you have to opt in, but they're also going to make it much more transparent that there is this opt-in, because so far unions have been not particularly forthcoming about the fact that their members don't actually have to pay them dues. They're going to curtail facility time. This is an outrage on both sides of the Atlantic, whereby civil servants supposedly working full-time for the government actually work full-time for the union, and so the taxpayer is paying the union officials' salaries. So they're going to curtail that, and that's something that we're trying to do over here as well. And then finally, they're going to reduce the corporate tax down to 20%. Any business owner in the room must surely be delighted by the idea of paying only 20% corporate tax. This will make UK corporate tax the lowest corporate tax in the OECD, I believe. So this is really good news for business. I think we can look forward to expanded economic growth from deregulation of business, a reduction in the risk of union-inspired industrial disruption, and a significantly reduced corporate tax rate. That's the good news. The bad news is that interventionism is alive and well. If the last part of my presentation was about the legacy of Lord Tebbit and Margaret Thatcher, this part of the presentation is about the legacy of Michael Heseltine, Margaret Thatcher's leadership challenger, who famously said, "We will intervene before breakfast, before lunch, and before dinner." I don't think there's a better description of this new mood of conservative interventionism than on the very first page of the contents of the Conservative manifesto, where they said, "We have a plan for every stage in your life," words that should make every libertarian shudder. We just need to look at what they're going to do. There's going to be a crackdown on aggressive tax avoidance. Tax avoidance, which, of course, the Supreme Court Justice Learned Hand said in the United States was actually a moral right. They're going to crack down on tax avoidance. They're going to try and coordinate with international regulatory bodies to have global tax evasion initiatives and try and cut down on tax havens. They're instituting 2 new financial regulators, a Financial Policy Committee and a Financial Conduct Authority, which is a bit like a British version of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is intervening so much in the financial industry in the United States. They're imposing a version of the Glass-Steagall law that was repealed in the 1990s here, which separates investment banking operations from retail banking operations. They're restricting bankers' bonuses and interfering with executive compensation arrangement. They've already capped payday loans and have, in complete disregard of all the studies that show the payday loans are actually beneficial to the poorest in society. They're going to spend huge amounts of money. Although they're not spending as much money on other things, they're going to spend huge amounts of money on infrastructure. They're going to create a northern powerhouse, they say, turn the north of England into an economic area as prosperous as the south of England by massive infrastructure projects. And they include these three three phrases. We will transform our railway network. They will transform the railway network in a private. The railway industry is supposed to be private. We will deliver faster internet. We will boost mobile coverage. They are claiming credit for as much as they can of the increase in the economy. They will increase minimum wage. They will force businesses to publish their gender wage pay gap. They will increase spending on the NHS. They have a policy called the Big Society, which is government helping what Edinburgh called the little platoons. But they're not very little when government is funding them. National Citizen Service, a sort of national service, a draft for young people, is to be expanded. They're going to expand Help to Buy. They're going to help more people to afford mortgages who can't otherwise. And we know what that led to. Going to protect the green belt and keep the planning restrictions in place that have led to very, very high housing costs in the United Kingdom. They're going to push for an aggressive global climate pact, and so on and so on. Yes, they have a plan for every stage in your life. This is an interventionist government. That's why my friend Matthew Sinclair, when he saw this, said, Hayek wept. Well, let's quickly get back to the good news. I think it is important to note that press freedom is back from the brink. There was a very real chance in the last Parliament that they might have imposed a press regulator on the free press in the UK. Looks like that is now going to become just a watchdog, and there will be explicit protection for journalists in a new British Bill of Rights. Police surveillance of journalists will be restricted as well. So those are some good points that we shouldn't forget about. And as Mark said, the appointment of John Whittingdale MP to look after the press and the BBC is very important. Again, he's a man with very strong views who should be able, and with a very forceful personality, who should be able to drive through these changes. And Mark has already talked about possible reforms to the BBC. But then there's the £11 billion pound question. What happens with the EU? One of the problems with the deregulatory initiatives is, in fact, most of UK regulation these days comes from the European Union. There are, by some accounts, up to 80% of regulation is now written in Brussels rather than in Westminster, although that 80% is probably a bit of an exaggeration. But this is where what Mark also talked about, the question of Europe and the Constitution really raises its head. This is the great external challenge for the Cameron government. Renegotiation of the EU treaties is his #1 foreign policy challenge. He has to deliver to the British public some form of renegotiation of the EU treaties. But there's great skepticism in Europe about this. When I was in Brussels a couple of months ago, I talked to a lot of people from European conservative parties and liberal parties in Brussels, and they were all very, very skeptical that Cameron could get the heads of government of Europe to agree to any meaningful renegotiation. So they had actually got to the stage where they were starting to discount any possibility of the UK remaining in the European Union. And we see this with things like the current negotiations on financial regulation there. Previously, the British government had essentially a veto over financial regulation because financial services are basically the #1 industry for the UK in Europe. That's gone. The veto has gone because the Europeans view themselves as writing rules for a Europe that's going forward without Britain. So I think it's very important to realize that there's skepticism in Europe about the possibility of renegotiation. Also, the logic of the Eurozone crisis speaks against Britain's renegotiation. The Eurozone crisis was caused by a huge mistake of going for a currency union ahead of a banking or political union. They've realized that was a big mistake. And so the Eurozone is increasingly committed to going to first banking and then full political union. Britain, of course, wants to go the other way. It wants, and that's the whole point of renegotiation, they want a less restrictive Europe. So we could end up with a two-speed Europe, something that the founders of the European Union wanted to avoid at all costs. This is why they always talk about ever closer union. If you have a Eurozone going forward for political union and a couple of countries, the UK, perhaps Denmark and Sweden, on the outside, you have a two-speed Europe with the unifying force of the Eurozone essentially forcing out the other countries. So really, Cameron should be looking at significant plans for Brexit. They should be drawing up plans for withdrawal from the European Union. They could look at the Norway option, they could look at a Swiss option, a full withdrawal. There's all sorts of things that they could look at. But at the same time, as Mark suggested, Euroscepticism has started to decline in the UK recently. So it's possible that we might get this two-speed Europe with Europe not really wanting Britain to be part of Europe, but Britain still voting to stay in. And you get the worst of both worlds. You have a Europe trying to reform itself in a manner that's incompatible with the British way of doing things, and Britain having said, yes, we'll go along with that. This could lead to a potential catastrophe in the future. I know Tom's going to talk a little bit about the Human Rights Act, so I'll end it there. But I think one thing that's important to remember is that 2015 is not only the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, it's also the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. And I think that's what's going to shape Britain over regards to Europe over the next few years.